Hi, I'm Jeff and welcome back to my shop. Today we're going to get inside this little lathe and do some upgrades and some repairs. So I've put a number of hours on this faithful little Grizzly. This particular one I've had since mid-September. This is the second one of these that, that I've owned in the past year. The first one lasted about 3 months and one of the gears inside of the headstock stripped. Today, what I'd like to do is actually break the entire machine down, and there's a couple of repairs, a couple of adjustments, and a couple of upgrades that I would like to do for the whole thing. Since the episode with Grizzly where they did replace the whole thing just because there was a gear stripped in the headstock, since then I figured out how you can actually pull the spindle out. So two of the things we're going to be doing is a little bit preventative of pulling this spindle out. We're going to upgrade the bearings. These are basic ball bearings in here, and for proper load and the best smoothness, we're going to be upgrading those to angled roller blades. So we're going to upgrade the bearings on the headstock, and that's supposed to give you a little bit more RPMs and give you better surface finishes, which I like. The next thing we're going to do is a little bit preventative. We're going to go in and actually change the gears inside of the headstock out for metal gears. What's in there is plastic, and honestly it's pretty tough plastic, but they will strip if something happens. And what had happened to me, I believe, that stripped the original lathe's gears was that I had some loose adjustments in my carriage, which caused for movement in the tool, which allows for it to catch and bind and put extra load on the spindle. The impetus for this is I've noticed in cutting that I can move the gears, and there it is, right where they mesh. I can feel there's a click. So something's not right in there, so we need to really just pull the headstock off and kind of investigate anyway. But if I'm going to be breaking it down that far, we may as well just take care of it. So I've been getting the parts from Little Machine Shop. They sell the two gears that are in the headstock for switching between high and low. They sell in metal. I don't know what kind of metal, but it is metal. Lastly, the gear on the motor itself, which drives the toothed belt, the timing belt, it is stripped completely smooth. So it's like a big worthless V-belt, and that's partially my own fault. It wasn't adjusted properly tight when I acquired the lathe, and since the belt had slack in it, it's a timing belt, so it has teeth. The rubber belt's actually just fine, but the teeth on the gear on the motor have stripped. And you've heard in other videos of mine what that sounds like. It sounds awful. And I never got the motor adjusted to the proper tension, and that allowed it to just kind of make itself worse at a kind of an exponential rate. So that's the point where I actually need to repair to make this lathe 100% again. So since we're going to be breaking it down, I figured I'd go ahead and just do all that stuff and collecting all the parts and the upgrades. And while we're at it, while we have it all taken apart, the other thing I'd like to do is go through this carriage and make sure that all of my gibs on the ways, the little adjusting bars that keep them tight but smooth, it's a real accurate balance there. I'd like to make sure that those are all properly adjusted, and I might actually polish them. A lot of times with these import machines, the gibs themselves are metal that's not entirely smooth. I mean, from what I've seen, it's not that bad. But it's something that if it's the smoother it is, the easier it will be to dial it in and get a very accurate and tight hold on its travel without it being difficult to move. And these are adjusted pretty reasonably well. These and this I keep in pretty decent adjustment. The carriage itself, I do believe I need to adjust the pads on the bottom that hold to the bed. I had some loose spots, and I did some spot adjustments, and it's generally fine, but while we got to take it apart, we'll look at it. So anyway, I've got a cup of coffee, I got all my parts, I've got the couple of jigs that I've made that we'll need to do, and now it's just pulling the screws. First thing we'll take off, obviously, is going to be the chuck, followed by the tool post. And here I'm disassembling most of the carriage of the lathe all the ways, the compound rest, as well as the cross slide. If you're just doing something inside the headstock, this really isn't necessary. But like I said, I really wanted to get into everything and make sure everything was in good adjustment. The lead screw doesn't need to be taken off. This bearing block just comes off with 2 screws and slides right out. It actually goes through the electronics unit up to the back of the headstock. The apron can be taken off once the lead screw is removed. It goes without saying, while you're messing with the electronics, that the lathe should have already been unplugged. And I actually used this video as a reference for where all of the items are plugged into, so I could plug them back into the right places. The actual power connectors up top are the only ones that really you need to pay attention to. The others are proprietary plugs, and then the ground can be disconnected from the headstock. Some of the import 7-inch lathes have a little bit different headstock configurations, especially with the RPM sensors. Some of them are actually inside that electronics unit and measure from within the headstock instead of out the back, such as this one. All of the gears that drive the lead screw, it's pretty straightforward, just pulling all those off, and the banjo. And you can see that's the actual pulley we'll be replacing. It is worn smooth. And it's really funny that the plastic gear stripped down smooth and the rubber belt is comparatively in decent condition. Those are the 2 motor mounts, which is how you actually adjust the belt tension. And you can see the motor there. That is a 650 watt motor, 3/4 horsepower. With the motor out of the way and all the covers removed, you can actually finally take the headstock off now. And there are 4 large bolts securing it to the bed. With everything removed from the bed, this gives us our other opportunity for this project, which is to clean everything out really well. And as you can see, I've got quite a bit of swarf collected underneath that bed in the places that my vacuum cleaner or hand brush wouldn't reach as easily. Remember, a clean work area is a precise and safe one. Now we're inside the headstock. You can see the plastic gears that actually drive the spindle, and there is a broken gear right there. Got a pirate smile. I don't know how that sheared off. Not sure what specifically did it, but we will have to replace it regardless. We need to take this drive gear off. There's a couple of C-clips holding this shaft on either end of it that you need to remove with, use the snap ring pliers. They're way easier. But it was on there pretty tight. Now we can also take off the other castle nut holding the rear gear to the back of the spindle, and this will ultimately allow us to get access at the spindle. The gear change lever just comes right out. It's a couple of pieces. It's got one that actually interacts with that lower gear and then the handle itself. And everything inside the headstock is coated in grease, which is good, but it's very dirty and kind of applied haphazardly. One of the other things that we will change. This was my original idea for pulling the headstock, which is running a piece of black pipe that would fit over the spindle and running a threaded rod through it out the back of the spindle with nuts on either side and basically tightening the nuts. This would act as a spindle puller, I'll put a link in the description of the website where I got this idea from. I didn't come up with this on my own, although ultimately it didn't work that well. But worked great is a hammer. Going from the back of the spindle with a piece of wood, propping the head of the lathe up in that tube with a piece of wood at the bottom just in case it fell out, it actually came out quite easily. Same with this intermediate shaft that holds the second gear inside the headstock. Fishing everything out of the headstock. And this was really funny. In the back of the bearing cover, which you'd never see, there was a screw stuck in there. This isn't from this job right here. I don't know where that screw came from, but it was stuck inside of that, not harming anything, apparently. Using a piece of cut aluminum as a bearing puller, or bearing splitter, I propped it between the bearing and the face of the spindle, and then, once again, with wooden block, rubber mallet, or just a rubber mallet, that's how we get the old bearings off. These are the new bearings, the tapered roller bearings, and what's required is to really, really, really work a lot of grease in there, just to really fill it in every possible way. But there's also, you can also over-grease them too, and I'm no mechanic, no expert. I just put what seemed to be the right amount of grease on there. Now the taper is going to face inward towards the headstock. And to drive this onto the spindle, I'm using some 1 3/8 inch tubing. It would be better to press it, but I don't have a press of that capacity and didn't want to buy one just for this job. And this actually worked just fine. The important thing when using this method is to make sure you're actually pressing on the very inside part of the bearing and not on the actual rollers or anything like that. And that's it on. There's part of it. This spacer I thought I was going to have to machine down, and I even made a specific arbor to hold it in the mill so I could machine a groove. With the other lathes, as reported by a number of people who have done this before, that spacer won't fit within that bearing. Now, I didn't have that issue here. As you can see, the spacer actually fits within the bearing just fine. And after pressing out the bearing in the rear of the headstock, now we can actually clean out some of that grease in there. And I'm sure it was still fine. It didn't look particularly bad or dirty. There was just a lot of it in there, and you're not supposed to mix greases. So since I'm using a different kind of grease, I'm getting all the old grease out. I'm using the old bearings, which is probably bad if you ever want to reuse them, to press in the races for the new bearings, since they are a more or less perfect fit for that pocket. And then we can actually start reassembling this. I've applied grease liberally all over the bearing as well as the gears. With as much grease as they put in the headstock, I imagine that they want quite a bit in there, although I didn't want so much that it would block things and become too messy. So I'm basically putting just a even coating on every surface that seemed like it needed it. And then a little extra just to be safe, but not too much. After the headstock is slid in, but before the rear bearing is put in place, we can put the intermediate shaft back in. This is a little tricky because those bearings kind of float, and you have to chase them back and forth a little bit. You can see where I had pressed it in from the one side and it pushed out the bearing from the other. So a good fixture or jig would have solved that problem. Now to put the rear bearing on, we can actually just use the spindle itself, and we don't even need to drive it on. That plastic spacer, along with the rear gear and the rear, I'm calling it a castle nut, a spanner nut. Those can actually be used, tightened down onto the spindle to press the bearing in place. And this is also how you can adjust the preload on the bearings, or how tight they're fitting into those races. If you haven't noticed it already, I'm using a spanner wrench from an AR-15. This is the multi-tool for doing work on one of those rifles, and it actually fits those nuts really, really well. I should get a proper wrench. The gear shift lever can be replaced, and as easy as it comes out, it goes back in. Don't lose the little ball detent that's under that lever. Now, to take the old pulley off, it's actually fixed with a set screw, which the new pulley's not. The replacement pulley from Little Machine Shop comes with its own key for the keyway on the motor. And it fit on there pretty well, although it was loose. You can see here that there's nothing really holding it in place. And it doesn't have a set screw or anything either. My thought was to basically just drill it and tap it for a set screw, thinking that, okay, well, it's just a variance in these parts. That happens with these hobby-level machines that are imported. So I just assumed that basically all we needed to do is fix the pulley on there. And so I drilled and tapped it for 832 because I stocked those set screws. And that would stick it to the shaft of the motor just fine, and we could be on our way. Now back to the rest of the lathe. Doing that cleaning I was talking about and really getting all that extra swarf out of there. There was a lot more than I even thought, and honestly, there was some parts I couldn't even get to in this state. But we got it reasonably cleaned up, and we can actually start adjusting the pressure pads on the saddle. With all these moving parts, and on any machine, there are adjustments you can make to make sure that it's not too tight nor too loose. It slides perfectly smooth without any sort of play, and it does take practice to be able to make those adjustments, but it's not difficult. It can be tedious, but not difficult. There are 6 screws on the bottom that you can tighten, as well as 4, maybe 6, that you can loosen as bracing. Tighten the gibs in the other way, or the pads. Anyway, adjust those till it runs smooth. Same with the gibs. This is the compound gibs. I got it out, and after cleaning it up a little bit, realized that I've actually already polished it. So it's fine. I didn't need to do anything with it. But we will readjust it, make sure everything's running smooth, and make sure that there's fresh and clean grease in there. And to return things back to their home, we start with the bed, obviously. And this is essentially reverse order of how we disassembled it. First the headstock. Next, we can put the motor on. And this is where the first adjustments for the tension on the belt will come into play. It's actually in the manual for this lathe that you want 1/8 of an inch deflection on the belt when you push into it. That'll give you a good sense of how to measure or gauge the tension, which is pretty taut, and that's what you want in a toothed belt, timing belt setup like this. I try to keep the motor adjusted as level as I can, although if you most certainly don't want it angled up because the belt will walk off of it. Now, this is the first test run, just to make sure that nothing flew apart and that everything basically functions. And you can hear that clicking. What that clicking is the belt and the new pulley. The belt actually did have some damage on it. And the new pulley, because it did not fit, I actually did some research. It turns out that Little Machine Shop sells pulleys in both 8mm and 9mm, with the 9mm listed as a 7x14 lathe option. That's the one I went with. Turns out my lathe's motor's shaft is 8mm. So the pulley's too big, and because I put a set screw in it, it was basically turning out of round, eccentric. But it is turning really well. And I decided to go ahead and go through the spindle bearing break-in procedure as listed in the manual. And that's about the top speed I was getting just doing that. And I did end up adjusting the tension on those bearings, the preload as it were, just to make sure that everything was running smooth and not too tight. I immediately ordered a new pulley, and one that fit the shaft, and installed it, as well as a new belt, just to be safe. And as you can see, it fit perfectly. I drove it on with a piece of wood, and the new belt is nice and taut. I think that's about an 1/8 inch of deflection. And it runs great. I didn't realize how hard it was for the camera to pick up the LCD readout for the RPMs. But we're in low gear right here. There's a very, very small amount of vibration I'm getting, and that is entirely due to the 4-jaw chuck. I didn't have all the jaws lined up, so it's a little bit off balance. Hence, vibration. Maxing out the low drive gear here. You can see it's 950 RPMs, which is about what I was getting before, although this is running incredibly smooth. Now, in the high gear setting, I was able to get it up to nearly 2200 RPMs. Now, for a cut test, this is actually the last piece of aluminum I cut with this lathe before this upgrade, and you can see there's a bit of a washy finish on the surface. We're taking 15 thousandths off just to start out. And I've just set the lathe at about 825 RPMs. The surface finish has improved greatly already, and using the lead screw for power feed, the lathe didn't even seem to notice it. Here's 20 thousandths. And this is off the radius. This is the actual depth of cut, not the total taken off of the diameter. No discernible change with 25 thousandths. Forty thousandths of an inch depth of cut is one full rotation of the cross-slide hand wheel. Now we're doing 45 thousandths of an inch. Before, as I recall correctly, I could only get about 30 thousandths of an inch before the lathe would start showing strain. Now here's a 50 thousandths of an inch depth of cut for this little Pee-wee lathe. That's taking 1/10 of an inch off the entire diameter of the work at 825 RPMs. Not bad. The surface finish, I think, is great. You can see there's some lines there, but they're incredibly even, and they're still very smooth, so I'm not getting that wishy-washy finish that I was getting before. So that's it. This is a pretty straightforward project. It took me a lot of planning. I did a lot of research before doing this and acquired my parts over a period of time. But I'm really happy with how it came out, and I really look forward to the things I can keep doing on this little tiny lathe. So thank you for watching, and hit subscribe if you liked it.